An American backpacker told me crazy paranormal stories, and then something happened to me. Experience high there. I felt the need to tell this crazy story that happened to me some time ago. The name has been changed. Short version below if interested. A few years ago, when I was 20, I met an American backpacker at a bus station in Paris. His name was Lucas, and he was 27. We had some time to kill before our bus, so we sat down and started talking. He was an adventurer at heart. He'd spent 6 months in the US in his hometown of Montana, where he lived with his mom, and then 6 months traveling the world, on foot or by sailboat. He was a sailor. He told me he was a marine engineer, or rather that he developed types of ropes for navigation, something like that. We clicked pretty well, so we exchanged Facebook contacts and stayed in touch. It was quite an unexpected encounter because this guy had tons of adventure stories, and he came from the US, which, for a little European like me, sounded really exotic. I felt like I was meeting someone who lived in an adventure movie, a world full of mysteries and fiction where crazy things always happen. Back then, I had just started university. I didn't have many friends, it was winter, I was in a new city. I wasn't really someone who liked going out at night or to concerts yet, so I spent most of my time at home, listening to music, watching series, drawing, playing video games. Lucas and I talked regularly. He was back in the US at that time, and because of the time difference, we got into the habit of talking very late at night. Sometimes I wouldn't go to bed until 3 a.m., or even later. He would tell me about his adventures. Every day, he had a new story. Like the time when, during a solo hike in the mountains, he came face to face with a pack of coyotes and had to shoot his pistol to get away. I thought his life was totally crazy, but as the stories went on, things started to feel stranger and stranger. Like I said, he was a sailor. He told me he often sailed from Florida to the Caribbean. Sometimes he took people with him. Sometimes he sailed alone. One day, he told me he'd met the Flying Dutchman. At first, I burst out laughing, but he was completely serious. So, half jokingly, I told him to go on. He described every detail, how the weather suddenly changed, how this huge dark ship he was approaching didn't show up on his radar. He said his first reaction was to think it was a drifting ship, that something went wrong with the boat crew, so he went closer. The ship looked very old. He didn't see anyone on board, but he heard music coming from it. I don't remember exactly what kind. In any case, he was alone, and he admitted he panicked. Something was very off with this ship, so he took the helm and moved away. But that was just the beginning of the crazy stories he told me. After that, I didn't really know what to think of our conversations. It was the first time someone told me a paranormal story with such seriousness, and especially such a wild one. I was more fascinated than skeptical. Something about our connection was captivating. It was an escape from the somewhat dull reality of my small provincial town. We called each other almost every night, and he told me anecdotes about his life, most of them quite believable. Part of me told me not to believe his Flying Dutchman story, but I wanted to see how far he would go. I thought I'd make up my mind later. I wasn't closed off to the paranormal. I'd actually experienced weird things myself when I was younger. But this was a bit beyond the I had weird noises in my attic at night level. 2. Do you know the Wendigo? I never heard of it until Lucas said he actually met it. One of his best childhood friends, whose name I forgot, was Native American. He came from a part of the US where traditions are still strong, or at least there's a will to preserve them. But I don't know enough on the topic to talk about it. So he knew these kinds of folk stories pretty well. With this friend, they would go about once a year into nature. Forest, mountains, to camp, hike, for a week or 10 days. One day, after 2 or 3 days of hiking in the forest, they decided to camp. They made a fire, ate, then had a drink. Night was falling. They were in the middle of a talk when suddenly Lucas felt a presence around the fire. He saw a figure, a blurred body shape, sitting next to them. His friend gestured for him to look at him. He seemed to say no with his eyes, which Lucas understood as, look at me, not at the figure. They looked at each other while trying to ignore this new presence. They were scared. His friend had tears in his eyes. It lasted a few minutes, then they realized the figure had disappeared. Later, they talked about the experience. His friend said it wasn't the first time he'd encountered a Wendigo. He advised Lucas not to look at it because the creature feeds on the attention it's given. If ignored, it disappears. When he told me that, it was late at night. I didn't dare move. He even joked, "Haha, maybe the Wendigo is in your attic." At the time, I had a small attic in my apartment, and I remember feeling really uneasy. I had troubles falling asleep. I stayed awake until morning. Hearing someone saying these kind of stories with that much sincerity was very unsettling. Here is the last part of my story. 3. Like I said, Lucas partly lived with his mother in a town in Montana, in an old house built during colonial times. He told me this house was haunted, but he always talked about it very calmly, as if it were normal and part of everyday life. He said he and his mother had always known the house was haunted, that they constantly had paranormal manifestations, and it had become part of their rhythm. He was basically saying that you just have to learn to live with it and respect all the souls who lived there before you. According to him, it was a matter of balance. He said there was one place in the house where he really didn't feel well and where he no longer set foot. In the basement, apparently, when he was a kid, he'd felt a very hostile presence and even saw a face watching him in the dark. There was a kind of big black stain on a brick wall, and all the energy seemed to come from that wall. Since then, he tries as much as possible not to go down to the basement. Anyway, since he said his house was haunted, I asked him to give me a video tour. It was night here and afternoon there. He showed me weird stuff. For example, he and his mother placed small bowls of salt all around the house, and there also were mirrors on the windowsills. All that was linked to the house's energy, as I remember. He continued the tour and said, "Well, what often happens is the lights turn on by themselves. Oh, look, they're on now." So, my mom and I got into the habit of turning them off as soon as we passed by. He entered the living room. He showed me a big solid wood sideboard and said the drawers were always left open, so they got used to closing them when they passed by. The drawers were indeed open, so he closed them. One drawer contained nothing but a Bible. I remember it was just a funny coincidence to me at the time. Anyway, at one point he took me to a hallway. There was a trap door in the floor leading to the basement. That basement he said he was scared of. He didn't open the trap door but approached it to show me. And here comes the moment I'm trying to approach. When he got closer, the video on my phone started to crackle. Colored lines, blue and red, appeared on my screen. The sound was completely distorted. The image was choppy, almost frozen, and I heard a heavy, low buzzing. When the image went back to normal a few seconds later, Lucas was in his bedroom. He had gotten scared and ran away. I said, "Did you see what just happened?" He said, "Yeah, it's the first time I've seen that." He didn't panic. I wouldn't say he was calm either, but not in shock. While I was terrified, my heart was racing, but my body was completely still. I just couldn't move. While it was happening thousands of kilometers from me, it felt so real. It was there with me. It really touched me to see him like this. I mean, unsettled by something. He was usually very impressive and confident, cool-headed, if I can say. He just said, "Well, I told you my house was haunted." Like if all of this was actually normal, see? At that moment, my thoughts were spinning. I thought back to all his crazy stories, this damn Flying Dutchman, this fucking Wendigo. I had always taken with some distance with these stuff and tried to analyze rationally. To be honest, I thought he was a bit eccentric, maybe a bit of a liar, but harmless, and that his stories amused me without me having to necessarily believe them 100%. But then I started to doubt. I wondered, what if all this is true? While he sat on his bed in his room and calm had returned, we started talking about something else. Suddenly, I heard a noise. At first, I didn't understand what it was. Then it became clear it was a voice. A very, very deep voice, almost inhuman, reciting something in a language I didn't know. I was studying linguistics at the time, and I was very interested in human languages. But this one was impossible to identify. If I had to compare, I'd say it sounded like a monk reciting a prayer. A deep, very monotone tone, reciting something very solemn. Lucas heard it too, but oddly I think I heard it louder than he did. I asked him, "Do you hear that noise?" He said yes, then went toward the source. He got to his living room, and the sound came from his Bluetooth speaker, lying on the floor against a wall charging, but it was turned off. He fiddled with the speaker, and the sound stopped. Then, barely a second later, I heard another voice. This time, a recognizable voice in English. It was the TV, the news was on. I asked if the TV had been on before, and he said no. It had just turned on by itself. He turned off the TV and nothing else happened after that. We kept talking occasionally. Then I met the person who became my ex at the time, so I changed my habits and started spending a lot of time with him. Naturally, Lucas and I drifted apart, but I still think about this story often. I wonder if he could have been making at least some of it up, either because he wanted your listening or to see how far he could lead you on her. This happened to me once. An innocent online conversation that eventually turned quite flirty, with photos being sent back and forth, etc. Then supposedly she had to go to the hospital and gave her phone to the nurse in case she didn't make it or some such. And then nothing. Eventually I looked for her under another account and there she was, with an entirely different story, husband still alive, a different chronic illness, and so on. She was making up a long, involved story and leading me along for months. Yeah, I saw Wendigo once too, flying over a church while an old man was praying with his hand on the entrance door. I was out for a run at night. The faces on walls and in shadows, I first saw them as a kid in a military sort of town. They appear from time to time. It's just a particularity of the brain to recognize faces in chaotic patterns, usually in the context of whatever mind state you are in. Things can get pretty weird sometimes, dudes. For some in good ways, for some in weirder ways. Anyway, depends on what you desire, and your parents and other complicated stuff. I've actually figured out a system for lots of stuff. Till next time. Even if your friend's stories often sounded incredulous, there's no reason to assume somebody is not experiencing supernatural occurrences in their home, and no way to really debunk it without being there. As far as mirrors and salt, it sounds like your friend and their mum were just going with whatever they learned from generations of folklore. If I recall correctly, many Germanic and Polish immigrants settled in the upper Midwest of the United States. Lots of traditions would have come with them.